Hello, good evening, everyone. Good evening. Thanks for coming out on a Thursday, the last Thursday of June, in the quasi-rain, I guess, for this finale of our series on environmental justice called Environmental Injustice, Race, Class, and Toxic Inequality. It's been an amazing, amazing series. My name is Marcia Eli. We're in the Center for Brooklyn History. I get to say a few words of welcome on behalf of the center and the Brooklyn Public Library, which we are part of, and the Arts and Culture team of the library, BPL Presents. So this evening, as I mentioned, is the third and final program in this series, and it turns to what we've subtitled The Way Forward, focusing on making real a transformative model of climate justice. Vann Newkirk, who has moderated all of these discussions, talks tonight to three incredible storytellers who bring their own imaginations to understanding the paths to a just climate future. Throughout this series, we've been honored to learn from truly the leading thinkers and doers, and we would not have been able to make that happen without the support of Con Edison. So we are very grateful for their funding and their support and their partnership. Now, please help me welcome Rachel Hutt, Con Ed's Program Officer of Business Relationships, to say a few words of welcome.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rachel Hutt. I work in strategic partnerships and oversee all of the business relationships, which excitingly includes Brooklyn Public Library. And we're starting tonight with a simple but urgent question. How do we respond not with fear, but with imagination and courage when it comes to finding a way to create a just and sustainable world? And at Con Edison, we're trying to create this world through a variety of ways. First, we partner with hundreds of nonprofits, including the Brooklyn Public Library, to give critical funding support to environmental, clean energy workforce development, and social justice causes to improve the quality of life in the neighborhoods we serve and live in, focusing on disadvantaged communities. This includes a $4 million commitment to train 1,200 community members from disadvantaged neighborhoods in clean energy and technology fields, and that's currently happening. We have got another year. It's been a 3-year initiative. We're also building the grid of the future through fortifying our system from extreme weather events. I think you all probably experienced the sad heat wave this past week. We are working on that. Creating clean energy hubs to facilitate offshore wind, and planning for new substations and local transmission projects to support clean energy sources and our customers' growing electrification needs. And we are empowering all of our customers to meet their climate goals through giving $34 million in energy efficiency incentives for low and moderate income households, among other initiatives. We cannot do this work alone. It takes everyone doing their part: the corporate world, grassroots organizers, public service organizations, and the local community. Thank you for being here. I look forward to an inspiring conversation focused on a collective environmental vision for our future based on empathy, equity, and justice.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Rachel. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how tonight will go. We were saying and commenting on the fact that being in this space together with these 4 people coming from Birmingham, Alabama, Oakland, California, outside of DC, and the Bronx, really is a special thing to bring everyone into the same space where they can have this conversation in front of us, for each other. I want to tell you what your going to experience. Following the conversation, which will be moderated by Vann, we're going to turn to your questions. Our usher is going to bring a mic to you at your seat if you have a question, and just raise your hand and they'll find you. Please stand while you speak and keep questions brief. And then following the program, I hope you'll join us for a little reception where you came in, a little beverage, a little wine, a little water, a little nibble, so we can continue the conversation more informally. So now, let me tell you more about our amazing guests and turn it over to them. Rose Eveleth is an award-winning reporter and writer who explores how humans tangle with science and technology. They're the creator and host of the award-winning podcast Tested from CBC and NPR's Embedded. Before that, they made the hit independent podcast Flash Forward, and their work, which has appeared in The Atlantic, CBS, Vox, Scientific America, Eater, The New York Times, 99% Invisible, ESPN's 30 for 30 podcast, has been nominated for a Peabody, an Emmy, and an Eisner Award. Emily Raboteau writes at the intersection of social and environmental justice, race, climate change, public art, and parenthood. Her latest book, Lessons for Survival, which, by the way, we actually have tonight at the shop, and I'm sure she'd be very, very happy for you to explore it, and I'm sure she'd be very happy for you to sign it. Her book was a finalist for the Brooklyn Public Library Book Prize and the Anisfield Wolf Book Award. Her work has appeared in The Atlantic, The New Yorker, New York Magazine, The Best American Science and Nature Writing, and elsewhere. A contributing editor at Orion Magazine and a regular contributor to the New York Review of Books, Raboteau serves as nonfiction faculty at the Breadloaf Environmental Writing Conference and is a professor in the Black Studies Department at the City College of New York. Mary Annaïse, I'm sorry, I knew I would get that wrong, Heglar. She told me how to say it, and I tried. Annaïse. Anyway, Mary Annaïse Heglar. She is the author of Troubled Waters and The World is Ours to Cherish, also books that we have here at CBH tonight. She is known for essays that dissect and interrogate the climate crisis that draw heavily on her personal experience as a Black woman with deep roots in the South. Her work has appeared in New York Magazine, The Nation, Vox, Rolling Stone. It's been featured in collections like All We Can Save, The World as We Knew It, The Black Agenda, Letters to the Earth, and Not Too Late. Mary is based in Birmingham, Alabama. And Vann R. Newkirk II is senior editor and moderator for tonight, is senior editor at The Atlantic and the host and co-creator of the narrative podcasts Floodlines and Holy Week. For years, Vann has covered voting rights, democracy, and environmental justice with a focus on how race and class shape the country's and the world's fundamental structures. He was a 2022 Andrew Carnegie Fellow, a 2020 11th Hour Fellow at New America, and a 2018 recipient of the American Society of Magazine Editors Ask Me Next Award. In 2021, he received the Peabody Award for Floodlines, and in 2024, he was named Journalist of the Year by the Washington Association of Black Journalists. Truly an incredible group of people sharing ideas tonight. Thank you so much for being here at the Center for Brooklyn History. Please help me welcome them all to the stage.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us and braving this light drizzle outside. And thank you to this dream team group of panelists. You'll find these are three, I think, of the most important minds, voices in the world, I think. I'm serious. And three people who have deeply inspired me by their work. And so if you haven't read or listened or engaged with their work, I kind of want to start by asking you a little bit about the things that, sort of sit up on the wall for me. And Rose, I'll start with you. Okay, so you created a podcast that I go back and listen to
Oh no.
all the time because it's so good and it does this job, this thing that we are trying to do, which is imagine. It's called Flash Forward. Can you tell us more about that show?
Sure. So I started Flash Forward. Now it feels like a million years ago in a different lifetime in both my life and in journalism's life and in podcast's life. But I had been assigned a story. It was my very early on, and I would do anything because for $200 I would write any story that any editor assigned me. And I had been assigned a story about this really amazing bionic hand. And so I interviewed the folks behind it, and they pitched me this incredible future where people are going to have these incredible hands, and they're, reading people's neural signatures and all of this sort of sci-fi. It's right out of the movies. It's this and that. And then I went and interviewed a bunch of folks who might use those hands, and they were all like, these hands are awful. We hate them. They don't actually work very well. They're really expensive. You can't repair them yourself, right? And so I interviewed a couple people who had a $30,000 hand in their closet that they never used. And I remember thinking like, well, hold on a minute, what's going on here? And looking around and seeing a lot of sort of futurism and coverage of technology. This was really at the time when tech coverage was primarily iPhone reviews, which were really just iPhone advertisements. And I just thought that was really strange, and there seemed to be a space for a show or something that tried to imagine futures and in fact actually talked to the people who might live in those futures and actually sort of be impacted by them. And that sort of is where Flash Forward came from. Every episode started with a sort of like trip to the future, so sort of a little bit of audio drama where you see what's happening in the future in these sort of fictional vignettes. And then afterwards, sort of these interviews with people who study history, people who would actually live in that future and might be impacted by it, people who think about sort of other ways of imagining this kind of idea, really trying to kind of get at what would this really be like to live in like a real specific way. And it was really fun, and I got to do it, and I enjoyed it.
You should listen. It's really good. Mary, we have talked a lot about your recent novel, Troubled Waters. And if you don't have it, you should go out and buy it from the shop. And if you do have it, you should go out and buy it from the shop. Mary, can you tell us a little bit more about that book?
Sure. So I got started writing Troubled Waters in 2014. I'm so sorry. The story is set in 2014. I got started writing it in 2019. And the simplest way that I can describe it is that it is about the climate change generation and the civil rights generation and the things that go unsaid between them. And quite often the thing that goes unsaid between them is thank you, because one does not understand the other's experience. And so the story it takes place mostly in Mississippi, where I'm from, in Port Gibson. I'm from both Birmingham and Port Gibson, so I'm a hybrid. But I set it there, and it's a story between a granddaughter and a grandmother. The granddaughter has become awakened to the realities and terrors of climate change, largely through the death of her brother, who died working on an oil boat, and has decided that she's done with more, she's done with like the petition form of climate activism, and she wants to do something bigger. And it scares her grandmother to death because, unbeknownst to her, her grandmother was one of the children who integrated the schools in Nashville, Tennessee in the 1950s. And so obviously these two need to talk, but people don't be talking. So it's sort of like the story of getting them to that type of conversation that they desperately need to have. And, it was interesting writing a book in 2019 that is set in 2014, because you start to realize how many things we were ignoring at that point. This is a time where we thought that angry white men on the internet were just trolls and that nobody actually really thought the things that they said. This is a time when Israel was very much bombing Gaza, and that was being swept underneath the rug. this was a time where climate change was still being talked about, like, is it or isn't it? I don't know. The experts have sorted out, right? In 2014, when that sounds crazy today, right? Like, I remember that was the time of the California drought. And it was sort of like, do we say this is connected to climate change or not? And like, obviously it was, right? And so it's just, you start to see how many things were just kind of ignored and missed at that time and how frustrating that is. And so I wanted to write that from the perspective of someone who is seeing all of these trends and also she's 20 years old, which means her frontal lobe is not developed yet. And so this is a point in your life where everything does feel like the end of the world. So what does the end of the world feel like? And so I wanted to like kind of explore that in that novel.
Emily, lessons for survival, I think, is going to be very interesting for folks who are in the city, right? And you wrote it also in this very interesting time, this crucible of the pandemic and stuff. Can you tell us more about that book?
Yeah, I would describe Lessons for Survival as a book of interconnected essays about like parenting through polycrisis issues. So like Rose, I'm very interested in futurity, and like Mary Annaïse, I'm very interested in intergenerational relationships as a parent, in particular in intergenerational justice, thinking, quite simply, because I want our children, and I'm not talking about my children specifically, to thrive. I had already been writing as somebody who's parenting 2 Black boys in New York City about social justice issues when I had a kind of environmental awakening to how environment and social justice connect. And I really like writing about public art that appears in my local habitat. So I teach in Harlem at City College. There's just amazing street art, and often it's about social issues. And one day I was walking to campus to teach creative writing, and I was going through St. Nicholas Park, which is one of those like hill parks. You're going up a steep staircase. And this was in 2018, which was kind of a watershed year with climate communication. It was a year an Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, IPCC report came out that was different from IPCC reports in the past in terms of an encouragement, I think, towards journalists to actually use alarmist language, which they'd been maybe sort of encouraged not to do prior to that. Is that right? Would you say? Mm-hmm. As journalists? All right, so here I am, and I recently read David Wallace Wells' Uninhabitable Earth, the essay that like grew into a book, the first of 2 essays that grew into a book in New York Magazine. So I was primed to my eyes were a little more open because the language he used in that essay was almost like a Jeremiad screed. Here's what we can imagine looking forward, and it's terrible. It's apocalyptic. And as a parent, right, as a mom, it's not an ethically pure position. As far as I understand, my children didn't ask to be born. I've brought them into a fallen world. This world that David Wallace Wells is describing, based on having read this very long report, sounds like hell. Mm-hmm. So I've just read that. Imagine I'm walking to campus to teach creative writing, and there in the middle of St. Nicholas Park is this sign. And it's a road sign, like the kind you normally see on a highway saying, like, icy conditions ahead, except it was in the middle of the park where people are walking their dog and playing Frisbee and not really noticing the sign. And it's flashing these really alarming messages about climate change, like 50 million climate refugees and no icebergs ahead, et cetera. And I felt like caught in my tracks and very absorbed by the sign and beguiled and intrigued and curious about its messaging, which was a little cheeky even, like, who put this here? It was obvious to me that it was an artist, but I didn't know who. And I posted a picture of it on then Twitter, and somebody else in Brooklyn posted like a picture of an identical sign in Sunset Park, Brooklyn, and said, it's here too. And then I did some sleuthing and found out, there's 10 of these signs staged around the 5 boroughs. And they're sponsored by the Climate Museum, which I didn't know existed. And by the way, for any New Yorker who's intrepid enough to visit all 10, And they're staged in parts of the city that are most threatened by the climate crisis, not as it will appear in some future reality, but as it exists now, either because you're in an urban heat island, or because you're in a flood zone. Almost in all cases, it's because you're in a community of color, a poor community of color, where there's also poisoning infrastructure and police brutality, and we know these things overlay. Anybody who visits all 10 of them will receive a gift. And I'm like one of those type A people. So I asked this guy who'd posted the sign in Sunset Park, do you want to go visit all 10 with me? And he said yes, alarmingly. And over the course of like a very warm, unseasonably warm fall, that 2018, we visited all 10 signs, and it was kind of an awakening. I told you the whole story just to say, like, it was really beautiful to do that in community with a stranger because we were addressing something hard, like another New Yorker, another citizen. And over the course of that time, like that became an essay where this pattern emerged for me of, well, I can record with my camera a picture of this art that is a gift to the community to make us really reflect, and sometimes even to give advice or information about how to protect ourselves. Because public art is very ephemeral. It's not going to last forever. And then I can, as a writer, reflect on that in community with other people. It became a kind of writing for me that, despite the really grim topic, I enjoyed because it wasn't doing it alone. And anyway, that's a pattern that emerged for me as a way of being an essayist, addressing issues, including climate change, but also police brutality and also pandemic, like writing, thinking through with others, kind of a polyphonic form of writing, if you will, that's also about responding to other artists thinking through these difficult issues. How do we cope with this?
Shout out to the Climate Museum. I am on the board. I think they do pretty good work, and I am glad that they helped inspire such a wonderful book. You mentioned The Uninhabitable Earth by David Wallace Wells, which occupies quite a bit of space still now in climate discussions. Like you said, it is really bleak. And I've always thought, I've been of the mind that, being sober about the things that happen if we don't take action is important. But your work, and also Rose, I keep going back and listening to, you have an episode of Flash Forward on land back. And I thought it was such a radically important thing to do what you did there, which was what I call like a positive imagination. What happens? What does it look like if we get our stuff together and actually take action? And I want to ask each of you, what would you say is the role or the importance of imagination in this climate work?
It's such a good question, and it's one that I think I've struggled with actually a lot, and I sort of go back and forth, because I think when I first started Flash Forward, I was a little bit more maybe naive about this idea that if we just imagine things and show people the way that things can be, that is like sufficient, or that can like pave the way for that happening. And sometimes I think that can be true, but it isn't inherent and isn't necessarily a given. And so I remember I started Flash Forward and I was working on things, and I was really like, wow, we can show people, we can give people. I think the thing that I really think is important about imagining is being really specific about what it actually looks like. And the land back episode was born out of a little bit of me just being like, well, what would actually kind of specifically that, how would that happen? Like, what would that look like? But also because I think sometimes when you work in spaces where you're asking for change, often you will hear this critique where it's like, well, you've not really thought through what that would actually mean. And in fact, many of those activists have indeed thought through what that would mean and how it would work and what it would look like. And, you hear this with, abolishing prisons, right? Where they're like, well, you have no plan. And it's like, we actually have a plan. Like, there is indeed a plan, right? And it's sort of this, I think, a way to dismiss some of what people are talking about. And so I was working on these episodes, and then I was also sort of watching the ways in which imagination gets co-opted by the very powers that are in fact actively working against the sort of justice that we are imagining, right? And watching, colleagues of mine in the sort of space of imagining and futurism writ large go to Dubai and do futurism in Dubai. And for Palantir. And I'm like, what, like, how does this work, right? Like, what are we doing here? Because it's sort of in the same way that, greenwashing happens and pinkwashing happens and all of these things, there's this really convenient way that some of these big corporations will bring people on and have them imagine these futures and talk about justice and talk about these like great, potential ways forward while they are quite literally actively fighting those exact things. And so I've been trying to think about what does it mean to imagine in a way that kind of has teeth to it. And I think actually that's what I really appreciate about like the work of the folks here is that and I come back to this idea of specificity. I think often when you see these presentations that folks do in these corporate spaces, like at literal Palantir,
Literal Palantir,
where you're like doing futurism for the war machine in a way that is like not a joke. I don't know. It's often very vague, right? It's like these sort of really broad, like it could be better. Things could be different, right? And I think that the thing that both Mary and Emily's work does so well is it has really specificity, like the sign in the park. You go to the places, right? Like, you have actual characters who are talking to each other and like the stories that you're telling in the journalistic way, and Vann, your work too, of like, you go to the place, you talk to the people. There are people in the future and they have specific wants and needs. And I think that to me, when I think about what the power of imagination is, it has to get really particular and it kind of really has to actually try and grapple with humans who are like weird and ornery and difficult and don't do the things that we want them to do, but also that's amazing a lot of the time. But also sometimes, I don't know, I like go back and forth. I fight myself with this where I'm like, am I just laundering the reputation of, technology as a force for good? I don't know. I struggle with this personally, actually, a lot.
Well, I think what you're talking about, which is the distinction between sort of a nebulous rainbows and clouds version of imagining versus actually going out and trying to understand material conditions and consequences of what we do, right? And also labeling the things that are in the way of that vision, right? And Mary, I want to turn to you because we've talked about this idea of climate joy. And I've been struck by this since you've mentioned it. This idea that there is a mode of thinking about climate and about action that grants agency to people, that gives a sense of purpose to the work. And I want to ask you more about climate joy.
So I definitely pick up that is a thinly veiled request for me to finally write that essay.
Yeah.
Smooth, real smooth.
No, this is me assigning things on stage.
With witnesses. So I've been thinking a lot about it. And I think I write a lot about the grief cycle as it relates to climate change. And what I often say is that, the thing that makes it different than the regular grief cycle is that there's no such thing as acceptance. Because how do you accept something like this, right? And also, like, the earth isn't dead and you're not either. We're both still here. So you can't get to that acceptance of you've lost this thing or this person that is important to you. And so I think, I often explain that as like, well, that's why you keep like cycling through and you go through the anger and you go through the mourning and all of those things all over again. But I also think there's another place to get to, which is, what I was describing as climate joy, but now I'm starting to think it's more climate gratitude. And I think gratitude really is the root of all joy. And so finding ways to practice gratitude even when the world is on fire, even when the world is drowning, right? And so finding ways to be grateful for your breath, being grateful for the ground that you stand on, grateful for the people that you've known, the people that you still have, even the people that you've lost, even being able to just be grateful for all of those experiences. And I think that could be a movement toward actually wanting to protect those things and appreciating how much you love those things and how grateful you are for them. But if I can, I would like to comment a little bit on what you and Rose were just talking about in terms of climate action. I think part of the problem in the way that we have talked about climate action in the past is it's been way too vague, because literally every action is a climate action, and including the ones that move you backwards, right? So like we've often said that like government inaction is the source of climate change. Subsidizing the fossil fuel industry is absolutely not an inaction. That is a very active thing. That's not passive. And even today, like we still say that we're governed by climate deniers, right? Donald Trump is not no climate denier. This man is out here trying to buy Greenland. He's trying to build a space force. You know, he's kicking immigrants out at a horrific speed and in terrible, terrible conditions. All of those things are climate actions. There is a such thing as ecofascism, and I think that is what we're actually living through right now. And so we need to get specific and we need to get serious.
You mentioned ecofascism, which is, I think, a great word for us to all remember. Because for me, fascism in history, it relies on dominating the story, right? Not just the people, not just the land, but the story. And in order to do that, the story of the present, it has to dominate the past, and it has to also take away any other vision of the future. And I want to basically ask you all, and I'll start with Emily. How do we think about the future, about how we carve out those spaces, those insurgent futures and imaginations in a world, in this time when we're bombarded with this story of there is no hope?
Yeah, was it Che Guevara who said something about the truest revolutionary is guided by love? Actually, we're talking about imagination, gratitude, joy, love, as feelings, energies, spirit to move toward. I've been very motivated, actually, by Mary Annaïse's essays. In addition to her beautiful novel, she's an astounding essayist and podcaster. I think we'll
all are everything.
Just
Yes,
everything. We'll get into that, too. How I think this subject demands, multiple modes of storytelling, and even invites, I think, radically interesting forms of storytelling. But I just want to bring up two essays of Mary Annaïse's that were very inspiring to me and have been very inspiring to my students because I teach climate writing at City College. One of them is the one that's about love. The greatest of these is love. Like, we all share something, whatever side we're on. We all share an impulse to protect the things that we love, whether that's a place or a child. Or future, right? And there's another essay that I think has maybe more than one title, but at one point the title was Climate Change Ain't the First Existential Threat. And I just love the reminder that, it's actually insulting to suggest that historically resilient peoples have not lived through apocalyptic moments in the past and are here actually, or historically have a lot to teach us about how to move through moments like this. So as interested as I am in thinking about imaginatively and concretely about the future, I also understand it's crucial to look to our past. And those of us who have ancestors who've lived through apocalyptic moments, and I put that in quotes purposefully, have a lot to teach us. And part of the motivation for my book, thinking about lessons for survival, was to acknowledge quite humbly, there's a lot I don't know. It is a very scary moment to be a human, to be a parent. How did my grandmother live through this? My Black grandmother, also from Mississippi, who moved along the pathway of the Great Migration to save her children, my father, my aunties, from Jim Crow after her husband had been lynched. My grandfather, when my father was in utero, right? I bring this up in the context of climate change because when we're talking about things like managed retreat, which is a strategy which people have used in places like Louisiana, at Staten Island in our city, that have become uninhabitable, or where it would be, you start to realize would be foolhardy to rebuild after destruction of a certain level, right, by the rising sea. We have examples of managed retreat as a form of resilience, survival, when there's a pathway to save you in a community that you are doing it among. It's nothing new. And so I just want to remark on the importance of thinking about looking backwards as much as we're looking forwards in the present moment.
With looking backwards, I read, I absorb. I don't even know how to say I engage with all of your work because you all work in so many different media and forms, but I osmose your stuff. And I'm always, I feel like, haunted in a good way by the ghost of Octavia Butler. And for me, the thing that Octavia Butler taught me was, in doing her very futuristic work, she was mining the past. In doing that, she was better understanding the past and helping us better understand what had already happened. And I just want to ask, I'll start with Rose. Do you see Octavia in your own work? And, I'll start there. Yeah.
I mean, it would be the dream to see Octavia in my own work. I mean, she's one of the great, stars that I feel like I return to over and over again. And she had such a, I mean, yeah, I don't know that I would say about my own work that I see her in it, because that feels like, a goal to try to work towards. But yeah, I mean, I think that, she's someone who does so many of the things that we've been talking about, right? Like seeing very clearly, naming things, actually saying out loud what things are, looking back and looking forward. I have a quote from one of her notebooks printed out above my desk. It's one of the ones that I'm sure many of you have seen, from sort of where she wrote on the back of her kind of brown cardboard cover of the books, and you can see them at the Huntington in Los Angeles. If you go, they have a collection, and it says, tell stories filled with facts, make people, I'm gonna maybe not get this exactly right, see and taste and feel, make people feel. And just this idea of specificity, which I guess keep coming back to today, is the specific facts, tell people true things that are specific and make them feel it and make them, taste it and see it. And that gets you so far, because we're all people, right? And we're all sort of living in this world in bodies, whether we like it or not, no matter what the tech people say is happening. We're all here, and that feels like a real kind of guiding light for me in terms of thinking about how to present ideas about the future without getting lost in the sauce a little bit. Of what might happen. I think the history point is so compelling. I'm working on a book proposal about that exact question. So it's
I don't want
late.
to steal your thunder.
And my agent's probably gonna be like, are you working on that book proposal? But yes, I think that there's so many incredible examples from history of times where people have taken back the control of who gets to tell you what the future looks like.
Well, I want to follow up there, because I think in the name of being specific, have you seen, models or crumbs or kernels of things that have helped foster this type of imagining in spaces?
Yeah, I'll give a kind of obscure example, which is the one that I'm currently in a research hole about, which is what are called radical almanacs. So almanacs were incredibly popular for a long time. They would tell you when to plant crops. They would tell you about astrology. They would tell you when you might want to try and have a child if you wanted the right kind of, energy. They were actually the sort of site of huge publishing wars in Europe because they were so valuable and popular, and every person bought one. And so if you were the people who printed almanacs, you were, golden. And what that meant was that everybody was reading these predictions about the future that were printed, and were printed in ways and with illustrations and with graphics that sort of were pretty accessible to the general public, even for folks who couldn't read, which meant that they were very powerful forms of telling people what the future could contain. And what that meant was that people would slip in sort of radical politics, and they would say, in the sort of veiled ways, don't, like, the king is bad, right, or whatever. And there was sort of developed these symbols that would go into these almanacs, and people would print their own radical almanacs that they would print on very cheap paper, and they would distribute to kind of spread the word around different ways of resistance, where meetings were happening, all of this really interesting stuff. And in fact, France passed a law in the mid-1700s that it was illegal to print anything about politics in almanacs. You could not say anything at all because they knew that people would read it and be like, well, this is going to happen. This is true. And in fact, that law was only repealed like 15 years ago. It was one of not that people were following it. But so it's a small thing. And it's sort of, people don't think of almanacs as being a source of radical imagining, but there was this sort of underground almanac printing happening in Europe that I find really fascinating as a way of trying to kind of take that control back of this thing that everybody was reading. And I don't know, I'm just like, that's what I'm currently really obsessed with. So that's my example.
I love that. We're almanacs, we've got art. I think I want to return, Emily, to the observation that you made, which was that this is a panel of folks who are working across disciplines, people who are doing, I don't even, again, know what to call you all because you do everything. And Mary, I want to ask you, what for you is the importance of, I guess, not being bound by genre or working across media and discipline?
That's a really hard question.
Or do you even think about it?
I do not.
Okay.
Not until this very moment. I don't know. I think I sort of think about the point I want to make and what is the best medium for it, or what's the best medium for me to tell it. And also, is it something I want to tell, or is it something I want to show? Is it something I want to explore, right? If it's something that I want to have a messy conversation in public, kind of the last place for that is the podcast arena. Can't really do that on the social medias or anywhere else, right? Or in an essay, you kind of need to know what you're talking about. An essay, like the essays that I've written have almost always been about a narrative that I want to change, and something I want to tell people about that. The novel, honestly, I've been writing the novel as long as I've been publishing essays. The novels just take longer. But the novel was wanting to show something. Among many things was sort of this idea that climate change was a generational rift, and this idea that climate change was the fault of previous generations. That always rubbed me the wrong way because my generation has been my ancestors have been trying to save this country from itself since forever. So I wanted to, that was something I wanted to show and show all the different layers of it. And, also show that you can write a novel that engages with climate change that is not set in the future, that is actually set in the recent past.
I am going to open the floor up for questions, so make sure that you have some ready. A question ends with a question mark, and I will say that is a question. It is not 3 questions. So I want to follow up before I do that, though. For people who are here who are more practically, I think, interested in, being storytellers and doing this kind of work, how do you face this is a debut novel for you. How do you face this prospect of doing new things, of learning new skills, of having to become sort of a new person and thinker? How do you tackle that practically?
Me?
Well, I was asking Mary, but yes, let's just. Who wants to take it?
I think if you are daunted by that, you shouldn't do it, right? Like follow the thing that you're interested in. I don't know. I think for a lot, I don't want to speak for you two, but like sort of similar to you're like, well, I don't really think about it. It's just like I want to do, like it calls to you, right? You have a thing where you're like, this is the place for this. This is what feels right. I want to do it, and then you run at it, and it's terrifying sometimes for sure. But you kind of, I don't know. I think trying to force yourself because you think it might be cool to make a podcast, don't do that. Like, you know, but I don't know. I do think that there is value in trying. I mean, we don't have time to not try new things at this point. Like, we got to get going. So, like, I think it is worth it to try.
I kind of like being daunted.
You,
think it's cool.
a little daunt as a treat.
Yes.
Yeah, I saw the eye contact. I knew that question was for me. So I guess I don't know. I did not really think about it. I thought about where the story was taking me, and then I went there. And also, yeah, it might be different than what other people were expecting from you, but those people don't know you. You know, like they can't whoop you. So if that's where you want to go, that's where you go.
Okay. Now, do we have a mic runner, or are we just gonna yell? All right. I want to open up for questions. Or we can freestyle until we have one.
Good evening. One of you mentioned wind machines in New York Harbor. New York Harbor. One of you mentioned putting wind machines. One of you mentioned putting wind machines in New York Harbor, but I can't remember which person did. A reference to wind machines, generating energy, alternative energy. I thought I heard it.
Yeah.
Oh, it was you. Then I'll ask you the question afterward. Thank you.
I want to know.
Hi, it's a simple question, really. Does any part of fighting climate change feel sort of American to you? And by that I mean, you know, when they were building the big industrial cities, they kind of had this really romantic idea that they were doing this. They're supposed to be doing this American thing. And even when they built the highways, and you have a car, you drive around, you have central air. There's something about that that feels almost attached to American identity or American mission or imagination. And I'm like, writers here, like, does any part of what you're doing and sort of figuring out the next era of industrial life, does any of it feel attached to that American identity at all?
Can I take it actually? Because yeah, I think you're right. I think the way we think about climate action in a lot of spaces among people who are very serious about it and, you know, who are in the trenches is it's the big project, right? It's NASA, it's the space race, it's the bomb, it's the big project. And that is a really, I think, you know, it's very attached to the American identity is the big project. But I think there are other ways to look at it. Other ways even, I wouldn't say that is the sole American way of thinking about tackling issues. There are other Americas. There are other groups here that have chosen to think of things in slightly different ways. And so for me, it's like, okay, what are the Seminoles in the Everglades in 1840 have to say about the project and how to do it? And so, no, I think that's a damn good question. And it's one that I think a lot of us should, in how we think about prescribing options, what climate action even is, what we consider to be a good action or a necessary one. We should check our corners and understand where the biases come from.
I'll add to that. I think for me, when I think of what feels American, I think of industrialism and I think also of individualism, and those are two things that I think we need to dismantle in order to actually face climate change. I think there's a lot of different solutions to climate change or remediations for climate change. One thing we're absolutely going to need is more reliance on community. That was something that, to go back to Octavia Butler, that you see a lot in her work that she gets right about this moment. I'm also going to plug Emily's book for that, because Emily's book showed me as an introvert who's like deeply afraid of making some of those connections, how to actually do that and how that is demanded in this moment of climate change. But the other thing about America, I think, is that it's a pretty young country, and it's changed dramatically multiple times over years. Like, we've had multiple American revolutions if we really sit down and think about it. This could yet be another. And I also think we probably need to move toward a world where these borders don't mean what we think they mean.
I just want to add to what both of these colleagues have said too, and thinking about America's a young country, certainly, and there are Americans who belong to communities who belong to communities that pre-exist the nation state. And so in looking for lessons for survival, thinking through futurity with curiosity and an impulse toward imagination, I had the wonderful opportunity to go to coastal Alaska, to go to the Arctic, to interview Yupik peoples who are American and also who are Yupik peoples who have survived the apocalypse, right? Who've been in that region for millennia and who understand deeply what it is to survive forces bent on destruction. And I just want to share this one story because it moved me so much. A man I talked to named Dennis Sheldon, whose name is also Kituraria, which means the one who's passing by. He told me his real name in this conversation, which I felt grateful for, his Yupik name. And I asked him, because he lives in a place where the permafrost is melting at such an accelerated rate that their homes are falling into the Yukon River, where if you're thinking futuristically, realistically, the people will have to move. But the terrain is changing so quickly that the question becomes where. And this is also a man who has survived one of these Indian schools in his childhood, now in his 80s, but at the age my boys are, like middle school age, was taken from his family, sent to one of these schools where, in the name of Christianity, they tried to beat his language out of him, his culture out of him. These schools where they cut the children's hair, in some cases molest, abuse, and kill them, right? To beat the Indian out of the child is like the motto of some of these schools, and he survived that. So my question for this man, in the context of the climate crisis, was how have you not died from anger? Like, how do you not die from anger? I genuinely want to know, because sometimes I am so angry, right? And internalized, I feel that as depression, right? How are you still here? What is your basic lesson for me? And his lesson was, that's easy. He smiled. It was shocking and also not. That's easy, he said, Emily, we take care of each other. And so your question, okay, when you think militaristically about the solution, right? Like, how can we fight climate change? It's almost, to me, the wrong question, which is why I try to think of it in terms of, for me, mothering is an ethic. And I don't mean in the biological sense, but as an ethic of nurture or care, as the antidote to violence. You don't fight violence with violence, right? I mean, that sounds so simple, but coming from his mouth, it was not, because he had enacted it and understood it deeply, right? I understood on like a deep spiritual level when he revealed this is his deepest truth and knowledge and understanding that he gave to me as if it was nothing, like so simple. We take care of each other. That was coming from an American, right? Like, he's not often given the mic when we're talking about climate change. He's certainly suffering from it. Then his response was not to think militaristically, like it's often posed, or we have to look back to how things were handled in World War II with our victory gardens, and this is like, it's our moonshot, right? It's often posed in these ways that have to do with militarization, as opposed to, what Saidiya Hartman says is the antidote to violence, is care. That's what this man understood.
Hi, my name is Sumia, and I'm actually visiting from France, just on vacation, chilling. And well, just if I can just comment on your question, is the most American question ever, like from an outsider's perspective. And I just wanted to ask you, in France, I'm actually from Algeria, North Africa, so it's, in terms of America, it's sort of like having the experience of a Mexican person here in France. My question is, like, I work in the sector of, environmentalism, sustainability, and it's very much divided, both from a class perspective and from a racial perspective, with this sort of stance that we as white people, I don't include myself in that, but like we as like wealthier, more powerful people, we have to take care of this because the rest of the population can't. And I really struggle with how to make the sector more inclusive, and I was wondering if you guys have experienced similar discussions and how you break those barriers a little bit.
Well, I think the reason that it looks like the sector is so white and so privileged or whatever is because there are people of color, there are people in frontline communities, people in the global south who are working on climate change, but they don't have the privilege of working solely on climate change. So usually when you find those people, they are, connecting it to things like police brutality, they're connecting it to poverty, they're connecting it to public health. And that, I think, is actually the correct way to look at it. And I think it also creates a world in which you're not exactly immune to ecofascism, but you're a little more aware of it. Like, I think when you separate the environment out as though, we're working on this environment in which nothing actually happens, there are no people, there are no systems, you can open a door to types of ecofascist actions, right? That can start to look like environmentalism. You can get to a place where it's like, oh, we need population control, which is just a wide open door to eugenics, right? And so I think once we start to see climate change as the world, and the world with people on it, and a world with systems on it, as the playing field on which all of these systems, play out, then environmentalism actually does start to look a lot more inclusive. And I think it's no accident that a lot of prison abolitionists got their start in environmentalism.
Well, I would also, I think we call it a sector. It's a way of thinking about, intellectually how this works. But if you really think as climate is just the world, it's just everything around us, then we should be thinking about, the little boys who give out waters right now as climate actors, as people who have some type of climate expertise. We should think about the people who are planning where to put fishing piers on disappearing land as climate actors and experts. And I think when you envision it that way, then again, if we're thinking about climate really as us making a world, then it starts to look a lot more like just self-determination and democracy. Well, I am happy to wrap it up so we can have some wine. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you to this wonderful panel for your expertise, for your wisdom, for your imagination. Thank you.
Thank you.